Hi, everyone, and welcome to Crossroads. My name is Alyssa Adams, and I'm the Deputy Director of Cross Labs, and I'm going to be your host for today. So, what is Cross Labs, you might be wondering? Well, we are a research laboratory here in Kyoto, Japan, and we are dedicated to understanding the very fundamentals of intelligence. So, it's a lot beyond, a lot of it has to do with not just what is artificial intelligence, but what are the essentials of intelligence? What does it mean to be an agent? What are the different diverse aspects of intelligence that we can see in biology? What are the diverse aspects of intelligence that we can see in artificial agents as well? Because this is such a big question, we have to explore lots of research from many different fields, hence our Crossroads seminar series. So we invite speakers from all over the world to talk about not just intelligence, but things like biological evolution, origin of life, games, and much, much more. Because if we understood living systems as well as we understood physics or chemistry, then we might be able to understand intelligence a little bit easier. Which is why we're really interested in these questions about origin of life and autocatalytic networks. So that brings us to today. So today we have a really, really exciting talk about autocatalytic networks from Praful Gagrani. So Praful is here with us today, and he recently got his PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He was studying the origin of life with Dr. David Baum, and now he's at the University of Tokyo studying at the Laboratory for Quantitative Biology. So I'm not going to delay things too much longer because this is a really exciting talk and I want you all to see it. So without any further ado, I'm going to now pass it over to Praful. Yep. Welcome.
Thanks for that introduction, Alyssa.
Of course.
And thanks for all of you for being here and inviting me.
Yeah, nice to see you here today.
Yeah, finally.
It's hot, right?
Yeah. So the title of my presentation is Autocatalytic Reaction Networks in Ecology, Evolutionary Biology, and Economics. So the outline is, I will first tell you what is autocatalysis, sort of more like an informal introduction, and then I will give you a mathematical formulation, and then how can we quantify the strength of autocatalysis. I will show how this metric can be applied to metabolic networks, and I'll end with some sort of informal discussion on autocatalysis in evolutionary biology and economics that sort of comes out from the work that I've done, and the works that other people have also done. So what's the background? We will phrase autocatalytic reaction networks in this broader framework of chemical reaction networks, just reaction networks. And these are directed multi-hypergraphs. So I'll clarify that. But you might remember an example like this from high school, where you have, for example, a reaction 2A goes to A plus B, or A plus B goes to 2A, and so on. Now, there's another way of rewriting this, and this is where you can see the hypergraph representation. A graph, it has nodes and edges, and hypergraph actually is something slightly more complicated, but here we can represent it with two types of nodes and two types of edges. So, for example, A and B, those are the two red nodes, and the white nodes which are called complexes. So 2A would mean there's two lines coming from A to this white node. So this white node corresponds to 2A. And similarly, A plus B, you have an edge going to A and edge going to B. And then you have a dashed arrow, a dashed edge, and that is representing the reaction. So, another sort of more mathematical formulation of a CRN is it's a triplet of three sets. So you have a species set, you have a complex set, and you have a reaction set. And the species are the vertices, the complexes are multi-sets of vertices. So one vertex can appear multiple times in a complex, which is a hypervertex. And a hyperedge is now a pair of two complexes or two hyperedges. Okay, so this is all, all different ways of seeing the same thing, just clarifying this. if people are curious. But now we come to how can we talk about, or how do we talk about autocatalysis, and what's exactly the problem that we're trying to address here. So, as Alyssa mentioned, my PhD was with a botanist, and we were working on the origins of life. And the first sort of characterization of living systems that one encounters is that life comes from other life, right? And this is attributed to Louis Pasteur, but I'm sure people before that also knew it, which is that life doesn't just appear from like spontaneously from non-living things, but this leads to the chicken egg problem, right? So if a chicken needs egg to come before it, and then the egg needs a chicken to come before it, so what exactly came first, you run into that sort of trouble. And so the perspective of autocatalysis and how this sort of helps you is to go around this paradox. Essentially, life is not about, it's not about the individuals, but it's more about the life cycle. It's more about the process. So I will say that more with an example of. So let's say now in our language of chemical reaction network, you have two species, child and adult, or you have an egg and you have a hen. Oh, by the way, just if anyone has any questions, please stop me, and we can go over it.
Oh, and we have a Slido as well.
Mhm.
So I just popped that into the YouTube channel. So like as a comment, so you can click on that link if you're watching live and ask your question there, or you can put it right in the YouTube chat. Or if you're here in the room, then feel free to just chime in.
Yeah, thank you. So we can represent the life cycle in two reactions in a very simplified way. One reaction is adult, gives another adult, which is the same thing itself, plus a child, and a child gives an adult. Okay, so these are the two reactions. And now notice a few things about this, and this is how we're going to formalize autocatalysis. Well, one thing is that if you run the first reaction twice, so which means you can start with whatever number of adults. Let's say, for sake of example, we start with one adult. It, well, maybe for sake of example, you'd have to start with two adults. So you start with two adults, and then they give two children, and then but one child gives one adult, right? So at the end, you'll be left with one new child and one new adult. So the change in child, changing the number of children, changing the number of adult is both positive. But notice that you needed at least an adult or a child to do this. If you didn't have anything on the left side, you could never, these reactions could never go through. So this sort of captures the idea. This is just an example. Autocatalysis is also defined in this paper as the process by which a combination of reactions involves a set of species which all increase in number conditional on species in the set itself. And these species are called the autocatalysts. In the sense that you need to have at least one adult or child to then be able to make more adults and children, right? So this is sort of the defining feature of an autocatalytic reaction network. Um, and let me just give you a few examples. That this is really everywhere. So even in nuclear fission, for example, you have a neutron which then collides with a radioactive element, which splits into two and gives you more neutrons at the end, right? And then these neutrons will then collide with more fuel and give you more neutrons out. So in this example, neutron is somehow an autocatalyst, which is catalyzing. So if you didn't have a neutron to begin with, in the sense of the fission process never started, then you wouldn't have new neutrons. But once you do, then you get more and more neutrons out of it, right? So in other work, we've shown that you can actually compose these autocatalytic networks and get all sorts of ecological dynamics. And the reference is here. Now, for the later part of the talk, I want to quickly tell you what is the correspondence between economics and chemistry, and you can, sort of go back and forth between this to whatever sort of suits, your intuition. Now, the idea in an economy, which is analogous to a reaction network, an economy consists of two things. You have goods or commodities, and you have industries. So the goods correspond to species and industries correspond to reaction in the following way. Now, what is an industry? It takes in a multi-set of goods. So it'll take in a combination of goods and it'll output a different combination of goods, right? So if you have an industry for making a bicycle, for example, it'll take wheels and it'll take a handlebar and it'll give you out a bicycle. So in this way, you can start representing an economy as a chemical reaction network, and then everything that I will say, and I will, of course, show you through this that there is a counterpart of this in economics that is actually useful to us. And okay, and just as an example, I already showed you egg goes to hen plus egg. Similarly, you can think of an iron, something that is mining iron from iron ore. But of course, you need some iron to even mine the iron ore. But once you do, then you actually get more iron at the end of it, and the iron ore remains. So these are all just sort of schematic things where we can make them more and more precise as much as we want, just like we can make chemistry and biochemistry, more and more precise with by putting in more and more details. All right. So that is sort of the basic idea of autocatalysis. Now I'll give you the mathematical formulation. And for that, we will now see that there is yet another way of representing CRNs or chemical reaction networks, which is that you can represent them with a pair of matrices, which we call the input matrix and the output matrix. So let's look at this example again. The first reaction is A plus B goes to 2A. Now, in the input matrix, or in both of these matrices, the rows are the species and the columns are the reactions. So the first reaction corresponds to the first column corresponds to the first reaction, which is A plus B goes to 2A. So notice A plus B is 1 and 1 on A and B, and 2A is 2 on A and 0 on B, right? So that vector corresponds to the output complex, and this is the vector that corresponds to the input complex. Now, similarly, the reverse reaction is 2A, so 2, 0 goes to 1, 1, right? So in this way, notice that you can represent any reaction network as a pair of matrices, which we call the input and the output matrix. And then another thing that we need to sort of introduce now is what you can do is you can run a reaction multiple times. So this is what we call a reaction flux. So for example, in the example that I showed you, we ran the reaction adult goes to adult plus child twice. So that was like, what's the flux on this reaction? How often is this happening? And now, assuming that you have an assignment of reaction fluxes, you can ask about what are the net species, what is the number of species that are consumed in this. So for example, if I run reaction A plus B to 2A kappa 1 times, I'm consuming kappa 1 of A and I'm consuming kappa 1 of B. But I'm also, so that'll be given by S minus times kappa, but I'm also producing, twice of A. So that's given by S plus times kappa. And then the difference of these two matrices is the stoichiometric matrix. And essentially, this will tell you what's the net production of this species under a reaction flux. And just for analogy, to make things clear, in an economy, the version of this is now we have all of these industries, but now you will ask, so the reaction flux corresponds to operation intensity of the industry in the sense, are you making 10 bicycles an hour or are you making 100 bicycles an hour, right? If you're running that industry at like a rate of 10 per hour, you will need 20 wheels and 10 handlebars to then pump out 10 bicycles. But if it's running at 100, then and so on and so forth, you will need 100 or 200 wheels and 100 bicycle bars to then make 100 bicycles. So that's sort of the analogy of reaction flux. Another thing that exists in chemistry is this concept of chemical potential. So the idea is that each species, each molecule has its species of formation. And when a reaction happens, you can ask about whether the Gibbs energy of the product is less than the Gibbs energy of the reaction. And if so, then that reaction is favorable because it's going towards a lower energy. The correspondence of this for an economy is you assign a price of goods to your goods. So you say, what's the price of some good? And then you can talk about what's the net profit by running an industry once, right? Which is take the prices of the output and then subtract them from the net price of the or the net, the total cost of the input. So and that'll give you the sort of, what's the cost of running an industry once. So you can see that this, hopefully this analogy clarifies and how to think about this. I will now set the economic uh, yeah,
Sorry.
sorry.
Oh, I just wanted to say that there's a quick question in the YouTube.
Please, yeah.
Yeah, so somebody is asking if they're about categories instead of matrices, just to do this analysis. So they're referencing Robert Rosen and biological autocatalysis using category theory instead of linear algebra. Have you heard of it?
No, I have not heard of formulation of autocatalysis with category theory, but I have heard of a formulate. Like, I know that the formulation of CRNs is done categorically, like, by John Byers and other people. So, but autocatalysis in particular, I'll be very interested. Yeah. So, did they post a paper in the chat?
No, there's no paper, but if you'd like to post a link to that, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. Very cool. Yeah. So the joys of cross-disciplinary researchers, right? This is great. Yeah. So now, just to give you the sort of so just overview, I'm building up to defining autocatalysis for you, and but I'm just like sort of giving you the things that we need, because at the end, when I show you things, I don't want you to, like, not feel that I've left things out. So we'll put everything in. So this is sort of so now consider this matrix representation where the rows are species and the columns are reactions. Now we'll define a partial network is if you just take a subset of reactions, and so for those subset of reactions, maybe some of the species never occur, right? So if you're looking maybe in one part of cellular metabolism, which is just this green part, there might be some species which just never occur in that subnetwork, which is fine. So that's what we call a partial network. And what we call a motif or a subnetwork is, instead of taking all the species that appear, you just take a subset of the species that appear inside of that, right? So this blue part is what we call a motif. Now, finally, I will define what an autocatalytic motif is. So a subnetwork or a motif is autocatalytic if it satisfies two properties, right? So property one is is that the motif has to be autonomous. Now, what do we mean by autonomous? It is that every species in this subnetwork, in this motif, it must be consumed by some other reaction, and it must be produced by some other reaction, right? So you are truly autonomous if everything that you need to build yourself up, you're actually producing it, right? So in this autocatalytic set, you'd want some reaction should exist that produces each of the species. And similarly, each reaction must consume something. So if a reaction is producing something out of nothing, then this is not really autonomy, right? Because I mean, it's sort of magical, and that means that we're leaving some things out. So you're truly autonomous if every reaction consumes things from the set, and it produces things in the set, and and correspondingly, the dual of that every species is consumed somewhere and is produced somewhere, right? Okay, so that's the notion of autonomy. And I will show you later that in an economic counterpart of this is a notion of circularity. So when you say, let's create a circular economy, what do we mean? We mean that, oh, there's so much waste that is being created that we're just disposing of. But if we can find another industry which consumes that waste and produces something that's again useful, now we have a notion of circularity, which is analogous in some sense to this notion of autonomy for economics. Second, we have a concept of productivity. Productivity is, we say a motif is productive if there exists a semi-positive flux, so that the net production of all species is strictly positive. And by that, I mean you need one flux assignment such that all the species in your network are actually net producing. Okay, so that's productivity. If they were being consumed, we could call that consumptivity, but we want to formalize autocatalysis, which is the idea that things are making more of themselves, right? So you need a way where they're producing more copies than they started out from. So that's the notion of productivity. We would need these things to be productive. Now, oh, do you have a question? Okay.
No, I
So,
just thought it was interesting. Sorry.
sorry. So now again in the matrix explanation, you might have in this partial network, there will be some subset of species that are both consumed and produced in a reaction, but then there will be some subset of species which are net produced in the reaction, and you're essentially looking at the intersection of what are the autonomous species and what are the species that are being produced, and that subnetwork then gives you an autocatalytic motif. You can say that that subnetwork can produce more of itself using itself, only that, right? And not things which are outside of it. Yeah. So that's sort of what we mean by autocatalytic motif. Now, of course, the first question you might think of is that in nature, though, these autocatalysts will not just produce more of themselves out of nothing. And indeed, when we embed this motif inside a bigger network, there will be some resources that are associated. So these autocatalysts need some food, and there will be some waste that is coming out, and there will be some species that are both consumed and produced, but do not produce themselves in excess. So this is what we call member species. But so let's just see an example of this in a reaction network. So the complete reaction network is this thing, where now the species are numbered with a bar on the top. So you can think of 4 with a bar on top as a carbon molecule with 4 carbon atoms, or 3 with the number is like a molecule with 3 atoms. So a 4 atom and a 4 molecule and a 3 molecule give a 6 molecule and a 1 molecule, and so on and so forth. You can read the reaction network, and you will find that indeed, if you write this up in a particular way, if you write the stoichiometric matrix in a particular way, in a particular order of species, now the molecule with 4 carbon atoms is only being consumed by this. It's not produced, right? It's only in the consumption side. So this is what we call a food resource for this motif. There's one which is one is only produced, so this is what we call waste. And similarly, now this 356 is actually the autocatalytic part, which can create more and more of itself. Okay, so these are things that will just come out of the math once you can represent the whole chemical reaction network or an economy as a sort of reaction network, and then we have algorithms to do this, and we've developed the math and so on and so forth to actually do things with this.
Quick question.
Yes.
Just to go back to autonomy really quickly, and that means that you don't need any inputs from the outside. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. So let me clarify this a little bit. We will say that a subnetwork is autonomous if it doesn't require an input from the outside. So let's just do it in this example. So if you just look at the green part over here, or the species which are in green, so 3 to 6, 5 to 3, 6 goes to 3 plus 5. Now that is an autonomous subnetwork inside a bigger network. So indeed, you will not, in a big network, there's some sort of embedding, right? And there's a subnetwork which is embedded inside. So the subnetwork might require food and will give out waste, but if you just narrow down on the subnetwork where you have this motif where you're only looking at these species and you forget everything else, then those species are autonomous, right? So if you want to think of this maybe in a biological context, maybe these are the things that are inside a cell wall and they can make more of themselves, but 4 is a resource that's provided outside the cell wall, and 1 is something that will diffuse from inside to the outside, right? So that's how you can sort of think of this. Thank you. Yeah, in economics interpretation, as I just told you, that autonomy corresponds to a circular economy and productivity would correspond to a growing economy. So if you can produce more goods, today than you did yesterday, you're in net, then you're growing as an economy, and then you can feed more consumers, so to speak. because in net you're producing more. And this is analogous to if a cell is growing in size, it needs to consume more resources, but it also produces more resources so that it can consume then in the next time step and grow yet bigger, right? So a cell that is growing, it constantly needs to produce more than it's consuming, and then it consumes that, and then produces more than consumes, and so on and so forth. So the version of that is a growing economy, and we will see this thing being made much more formal, but at the end of the talk. Okay, so now I'll take a water break.
Always good to stay hydrated.
Yeah. So then we have a characterization of autocatalytic networks, but the next question that I had was, well, how do we assign a strength to this autocatalytic networks? And the reason is, with this characterization, you can identify like loads and loads of networks, but then what do you do with it, right? And there wasn't like something along that line that was already figured out. Is how do you deal with this really long list of autocatalytic motifs? So the metric that we introduce is a strength of autocatalysis, which we define as its maximum growth factor. And this is just a topological factor which will tell you, its maximum growth. And so now I will define it. So it's done in this min-max way, but first let me point you out to what's inside of it. So we're looking at what is the net. So remember, S plus was the output matrix, and S plus times X, where X is a flux of reactions, it'll tell you how much of species S are you producing under a reaction flux X. And S minus X will tell you how much of species S are you consuming under a reaction flux X. So the ratio tells you what's the ratio of production to consumption of each species S, okay, under a reaction flux X. Now you ask, what is the minimum ratio of production to consumption among all the species? So that's this part. So that's the minimum part. And you take the infimum, just because it can blow up to it can be infinite or whatever. But just the minimum over all species, you consider that, and then you want to say what's the maximum X, what's the maximum flux that maximizes the minimum ratio of production to consumption, right? So this is a standard like min-max way of saying that, look, we cannot do better than this in the sense, and what can we not do? This factor alpha is essentially going to tell you what's the rate, what's the maximum factor at which you're producing alpha times as much as you're consuming, at least alpha times as much as you're consuming for any of the species involved, right? Because this is infimum over all species, and that's the best you can do. So so you can recast this problem as a linear optimization problem as follows. So alpha of G is maximize alpha, so that S plus X, which is the output, which is how much you're producing, is greater than or equal to alpha S minus X. This is how much you're consuming. And then you have some constraints on, just normalization. So these are two ways in which we can do this, and we have a solver to do this. But what I'm really here to tell you is sort of this is really a metric that captures the thing that you want to capture. So let me try to convince you of that. And so the first thing, remember, alpha is this ratio of production to consumption, and I should have this, and I don't. Where first consider when production is equal to consumption, right? Alpha will be equal to 1. So alpha equal to 1 corresponds to some sort of balanced growth. It's neither producing nor is it consuming in there. Alpha greater than 1 means that the system can actually produce more than it consumes. Alpha less than 1 means that it is inhibitory, in the sense that the more you run it at that optimal state, the more the population is shrinking. Okay. And so let's just see some examples. For example, if you have A to B, B to 2A, you can find the metric for this, and it's square root of 2, which is 1.4, which is greater than 1. And indeed, you can see that A is making B and B is making 2A. So then you can use A to make more B and B to make more of A. And in net, this thing will grow, and it is indeed autocatalytic. Now you can sort of reverse the reactions, and you can go 2A goes to B and B goes to A, and this is what we call an auto-inhibitory reaction because it is also autonomous. And indeed, the maximum growth factor for this is less than 1. Now we can see more sort of ecological examples, and we can now start assigning, this we can use this metric to quantify the strength of this ecological interaction. So, for example, in cross-feeding a kind of network, you have A goes to B plus C. So A goes to B and B goes to 2A is one autocatalytic subnetwork. You have C to D, D to 2C is another one. But now C is producing but now the first autocatalytic motif is producing something for the second one, and the second one is producing something for the first one. And indeed, now this example of like symbiosis, you can see that the growth rate of this is higher than what this network, what either of them could have done alone, right? So you can see that you can quantify that indeed if they're working in this cross-feeding way, then they're doing better than what they were doing alone. Now, interestingly, you can also compose uh, an autocatalytic network with an auto-inhibitory motif. So 2C goes to D, D goes to C, which is like this example. This would be doing worse, right, if it was running by itself. But if you compose it in the right way, you can see that even now this whole system can be growing, right? And the kind of and the title that I give this example is waste recycling, in the sense that imagine you have something, you have a system which is producing some waste, right, which is C. But now if you can find a way to use this waste to somehow the waste by itself cannot be autocatalytic. Like you cannot, you can't expect that you can create more waste with waste, right? Well, so you have this auto-inhibitory reaction. But indeed, if you can create something like, let's say this is like a glass manufacturer, or like um, spectacles, or what do you call it, sunglasses, sunglass manufacturing, sort of industry, where now they create some waste. But if you can use that waste to create more sunglasses, for example, if you can somehow feed back into that, then the whole industry as a whole can grow at a rate faster than it would have had it just been creating sunglasses and just pumping out this waste into the environment. So I feel like, this kind of ecological thinking, we can make it more precise and more, and run these networks and find what the optimal rate at which these industries should be. And you will see that we can also say what should be the prices on these goods. We can also optimally assign them. And so that's sort of the framework that this sort of builds up on and builds towards. As the Now for the application, so now I'll show you some applications of this to just metabolic networks, because this was closer to what I did. And I mean, this is all stuff that I've done and for the kind of science that I've been doing. um, which is, so first is this synthetic chemistry. So imagine that you only care about carbon atoms, and you consider all the different molecule reactions that you can have. So 1 plus 1 goes to 2. So you have a molecule with size 2 being formed with 2 molecules of size 1, or 2 atoms of size 1, whatever, and so on and so forth. So this is like a completely connected reaction network where everything makes sense, from a stoichiometric point of view or from a carbon conservation point of view. And you can ask, oh, can you find the autocatalytic motifs in that? And yes, we can. There's this sort of explosion, and we can characterize them as like, yo, these are the food and these are the waste that this one is producing, and then these are the autocatalytic species. So we can somehow take these autocatalytic, zoo of autocatalytic motifs, and we can organize them in a somewhat nice way by what are the food, what are the resources that they're consuming, and what are the autocatalytic species. And this indeed has a polyhedral geometric interpretation that is in the paper. But the one thing that we find is, as I was alluding to earlier, that these networks can have exponentially blowing up autocatalytic motifs, right? Minimal autocatalytic motifs. And what do I mean by a minimal autocatalytic motif? I mean that if you were to remove any species, or if you were to remove any reaction, the thing will cease to be autocatalytic, right? So it's minimal in that sense. So as I was saying, you have this, exponentially growing minimal set of minimal autocatalytic motifs. And what do you do with that? Well, then what we did is we came up with a metric, and then we used it on the Formose reaction network. The Formose reaction network models the prebiotic synthesis of simple sugars such as ribose from formaldehyde. So, the idea and I'm also very far away from chemistry, but the idea is that you have a one carbon atom molecule which is used to make molecules with more and more carbon atoms, right? So you can see C8 and C7. So this is what the Formose reaction network looks like. And sort of the thing that we found is that we're now looking for what are the strongest autocatalytic subnetworks in the Formose reaction network. And we find that that there's so many minimal autocatalytic motifs, but the strongest autocatalytic motif, in the sense the one with the highest growth factor, is actually a minimal autocatalytic motif. And what that means is, if you are to remove any species or you remove any reaction, this motif will not be autocatalytic anymore. So I am stressing on this, but this will become more clear as I go to my next example, where we ran this on E. coli core metabolism reaction network. So it's a very messy network, but the thing that we found is, so this is what the strongest autocatalytic motif looks like. And right away, the color coding is telling you the different minimal motifs which are inside of the strongest motif. Okay, so red is one thing and purple is one thing, so it composes of 5 different motifs. And one thing that we 5 different minimal motifs. And one thing that we find is, if you just look at the minimal motifs in the metabolism, the maximum growth factor that it can have is 1.8. But if you look at the strongest autocatalytic motif, the growth factor is 2.77. So somehow, and each of these motifs are not really strong by themselves. So somehow you can put together some things which are mediocre in their autocatalysis, but you can create something that is more autocatalytic than any of them, right? And indeed, this is a robust thing, in the sense that you can remove reactions, or you can remove edges or nodes from this, and it will still be autocatalytic. And this is just something that we found in the E. coli core metabolism, that this is how the strongest subnetwork behaves. And we suspect that this is generic. And if you really look down at the chemistry, you can start seeing that the way in which these motifs feed into each other to create something that's stronger than any of them individually is like non-trivial, and like you can look at it, it's like, oh, cool. But it would be hard to have guessed this earlier, without unless we have a proper theory of how can we compose minimal autocatalytic motifs to make things which are stronger than it, right? And that's some sort of future research that I'm interested in doing, sort of from a more mathematical point of view. Right. So now I will conclude with some discussion in terms of in terms of metabolic networks. As I said, we found that the strongest autocatalytic motif in a prebiotic chemistry is a minimal motif, but the strongest autocatalytic motif in a biotic chemistry is a robust non-minimal motif. So the first question is this generic, right? Like, if I were to pick a different prebiotic chemistry, or if I were to pick a different core metabolism of some other organism, will I find that this thing holds true? I don't know, because I haven't done it, but I highly suspect that it could be that indeed the organisms, they do somehow have an autocatalytic subnetwork which is really robust, right? So even if you remove a few species or few reactions, it will still be autocatalytic, and the network will still continue to grow, and the organism will still continue to survive. Seems generic, but needs to be checked out. And
does this also mean in some sense that the whole is more than the sum of the parts?
right. So this is how you can really quantify by how much more is the sum, right? Because as we saw, that you can put these things together, and then they can grow indeed faster than what any of them could have. So indeed, like, I feel this is the strength of this metric, is now we can start quantifying this by putting networks together and seeing what the network as a whole can do, which none of its parts could have done, right? And so question, is this generic? And if so, what is the evolution of such robustness, right? So how can it come about? How did it happen that prebiotic chemistry, which is not where the whole is sum of its parts, you just have these minimal motifs which are strong, but somehow they can come together and create something that says that the whole is now more than the sum of its parts, right? So how does this happen? Can we create some sort of evolutionary, hypothesis for this? What kind of maybe there's some kind of network expansion algorithms that we can think about where this generically happens, and if so, that'll be very interesting, right? But these are some kinds of questions that are interesting. Now I will talk briefly about research which is not mine, which is so this is work done by Eric Smith, who is also my co-advisor. So so in population biology, the perspective that people take, whether you're thinking about price equation or otherwise, is they're replicators, and these replicators are objects which will have some fitness, and they will create more replicators, even or either like themselves or like other replicators, right? So that's sort of the usual setup of a population biology setting. But the perspective to which now we can sort of generalize this is to move away from an object oriented sort of understanding to more of a process oriented understanding. So remember, I was telling you that we can define living things as these life cycles, and indeed you can do this even at the genetic level. So capital A, small a, these are genotypes, and then you have haplotypes, which is just a which are yeah which are gametes, so which are representing gametes. So now somehow the life cycle of a genotype AA, of how this came about, you're not just counting how many AAs there are, but what you can do is you can decompose this into autocatalytic flows. So you can say, this set of reactions happening is one life cycle. Another set of reactions happening is one life cycle. And of course, the same species can contribute to different life cycles, and the same reaction can come up in different life cycles. But what we really want to understand now is how do the presence of these multiple life cycles next to each other uh, feed back into other life cycles. And what I mean is, for example, if you think about price equation again, you have that some some species, if they're cooperating or if they're defecting, they can increase the fitness of the whole, they can decrease the fitness of the whole, and so on and so forth. But there must be a life cycle version of this, and this is what Eric sort of constructs, at least for this example in this paper Beyond Fitness, where he extends the price equation. So now you also have an apportionment based on the different life cycles, rather than just different replicators. And we can talk more about this in detail, but I think this is the kind of analysis that our formalism just opens up to, because we can now decompose networks into these autocatalytic flows. And the questions that we'd be interested in are asking, how does one autocatalytic flow affect itself and affect other autocatalytic flows? And I think that's the correct, or not correct, but like a better generalization of population biology, where we're moving away from a replicator focused perspective to more like a life cycle focused perspective. And of course, this will also apply to economics, hopefully, like by analogy. Now, finally, I want to talk to you about the von Neumann's model of general economic equilibrium, which is from where this metric that I showed you was actually inspired from. So von Neumann did this work, 1940s, of course. So the idea is that he defines a factor which now depends on P is the price vector and X is the operation vector. And I will spare you the details, but things really work the same, where you're asking how should you price your goods and how should you run your industries, such that if today you're doing something at let's say at unit 1, then tomorrow you're doing it at unit lambda, and in the sense that you're producing more than you're consuming at unit lambda, and then so that in the next time step you can reinvest all of the new things, all of the excess that you have, to produce yet more things. And if you can keep doing this in some sort of exponential way, then that's his notion of a general economic equilibrium, in the sense that things are not in equilibrium because they're not canceling out, they're actually growing in a very self-similar way. And again, he uses very simple assumptions, and he proves that which is even weaker than autocatalysis, and he proves that an optimal assignment of growth, intensity, and prices will exist for any network that satisfies this, which is like our notion of autonomy. So for autonomous networks, like such an optimal assignment does exist, and the beauty of this optimality sort of framework or formalism is that there's no profit at optimality, in the sense that you are really optimal and industry is doing things optimally if it's not making any profit, because if it were making profit, then another industry could have reduced the prices a little bit and done the same thing, right? So then the first one couldn't have been optimal to begin with. So somehow optimality is directly linked to, there's no profit, and in economics, although we've like sort of went really far away from that, but I feel this kind of principle might really have a deep implication in thinking about the economics of the future, but also in thinking about the biochemistry, right? That indeed maybe the way the assignment of either some sort of chemical potential, some kind of free energy that works in species is done in such a way that the system can grow as a whole, but none of it is somehow being wasted, right? So we have this very strong feeling that evolution, through its like millions of years that it has reached optimality. Well, this would be one way to formalize it and then to test it, in this language. So that's sort of the outlook of that part of the discussion. So I'll end with some acknowledgements. So this work, so I don't do any linear programming or any of that. I just do more of the math. And this was done in collaboration with Victor, who is a professor at University of Granada and his graduate student. And this other work that I did as a PhD student in Wisconsin. And these are my co-advisors. Thank you. And please ask questions if you have any.
Yay! Thanks so much for that. That was super insightful and extremely interesting. I think this measure that you had introduced and talked about seems really, really useful, and connects to a lot of things that are not just like biochemistry and economics, but the whole time I was thinking about all the different applications that you could use these concepts for. And, I'm thinking about like, well, what about the formation of like very basic agents? Like, can it be something that we can use to understand intelligence? Maybe is it something that we can use to understand learning? Is it something that we can use to, I don't know, like understand how objects become technological tools that we use and for particular uses? Those are just like very loose thoughts that I had an immediate reaction, but of course you've thought about this for much, much longer. So I guess like my question is like, when you were working on these things, of course you were thinking about economics, but were you also thinking about other applications as well?
So that's very interesting that you bring this up. Indeed, I haven't. So of course there's the concept of memetics, right? So corresponding to I feel that's the beauty of CRNs, is that it's such a multi-directed hypergraphs. It's such a somehow flexible system that you can phrase mimetic things in this as well, right? So I think I don't know about all the things that you said, but there should be, if you can think of maybe like tokens of language, and maybe how language spreads or something. I mean, we'd have to put everything down, or construct some CRN version of a mimetic system. But I think that should be possible to do. And once it is, then we should be able to see that the auto. Yeah. Then after that, the framework will sort of the math is developed enough that it'll tell you what really is the autocatalytic part and what is not. I mean, something that I can think of, I don't know, is like, let's say, there's like fire here, and then you say fire, and I hear fire, and then I say fire, and more people say fire. So like you can see that if we were to represent this as some sort of CRN where like now there's one person shouting fire, but now there's two people shouting fire, and so on and so forth. If these are the reactions that are happening, right, then indeed that is autocatalytic, and it's in I guess it's aligns with our intuition as well, right? Because when we're freaking out, we're all freaking out together. So I think this can be done, yeah. But I haven't, of course, thought about this in the sense I haven't read the literature on how people who are doing mimetics have actually tried to make models. But yeah, if you have any readings or recommendations, we can certainly think about making CRN versions of that. Yeah, and it can be done, I think. I think that's the beauty of this framework, that it's so broad. Yeah.
Which is why I absolutely love this, and why I'm like thinking of so many things. But I'm also curious to know, are there any things that we need to check? So, for example, like, because I know that CRNs are based on chemistry, and I know that like mass conservation is an important thing, I think, for this, but I'm not totally sure.
We don't require it. Yeah. Oh. Yeah, because this is it. So that's why I want to somehow move from CRNs to directed multi-hypergraphs, where there's no notion of conservation or anything. I mean, those are all things that you can if they exist, they will help you do something, but it's not a requirement. Like, all that is required is to be able to make some kind of a hypergraph structure, essentially, where you have nodes, and then you have two types of nodes, you have two types of edges. So one are your species, and they correspond, they attach themselves to complexes. So complexes, you can think of them in chemistry, it is literally when two molecules bounce into each other, and then they will transmute to become something else, right? They might either become a new molecule, or they might have a third, there might be like a third molecule that comes out. So that's the process that chemistry sort of thinks about. But in economics, as I was saying, industry takes in stuff and gives out stuff. Now, I guess for you, if you want, you can have agents be like industries, right? And then the tokens that they receive and they spit out will be like your species. So you could maybe formalize things that way, and then you're now exactly in this multi-directed hypergraph world, and then all of those tools will be applicable. Yeah.
That's that may I'm already thinking about like, okay, well, if we have agents that are learning and agents that are adapting, like, how can we use this hypergraph framework and look at whether if something is autonomous, or is it being productive? And
what would be the counterpart of species? Like, what would be the tokens that these agents take in and give out?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. Does anybody have any idea? I guess like, so if I'm thinking about it in terms of machine learning, right? Obviously you have like the inputs and outputs about like the embedding. Like, you have like your inputs, right? They go through some sort of embedding process, and they get converted into something that the network inside can read. And then, of course, like the opposite thing happens at the very end. So that could be possible, but maybe that's really not the approach. Maybe, for example, it has a lot more to do with a more abstract notion of what a concept is, or like how concepts are learned based on data that they're consuming. For example, maybe an agent that's learning, and during the learning process, as it's consuming data, it's starting to form these different concepts, and at some point, maybe I don't know. Like, I'm just like, I haven't thought about this for more than 3 seconds, but it's something that I'm going to continue to think about.
Yeah. We should talk about this more, because it seems that there might be like a biochemical analogy to all of this as well, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it must. Yeah. So yeah. I mean, I like reasoning through analogies sometimes, and that certainly seems doable if we can formalize what exactly we want to do. Yeah.
And so, just a reminder, there's the Slido. Please feel free to pop questions there, or you can pop them in the YouTube live channel. And there are a couple of questions in here, so please. I'm gonna read some of them. So we've got is real life exemplary of von Neumann's results. So nothing in nature is still, and evolution always finds a way to surprise us. So how is this result like to be presented in the context of evolution?
Sorry. Can you repeat?
Oh, I guess so the idea of this question is for von Neumann's results, does this truly reflect what's happening in real life? Like in particular, like with biological evolution.
Oh, like the final thing with the growing part.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, so but sorry, evolution. Right. Okay, yeah, I see. I think I understand the question. So indeed, sort of the solutions that von Neumann was looking for are in this general equilibrium setting is and honestly this is a deeper problem of this growth mindset, right? So the general equilibrium is that today you're operating at some intensity, tomorrow you'll be operating at lambda times that intensity, where it's hopefully lambda is greater than 1, and we're all growing, right? Now of course I think that's what the question is, that this will break down. Why? Because there's other things like this equilibrium. It's a mathematical thing, it will not really sustain. Why? Because maybe we're creating too much waste, right? Or maybe the resources that we need to do this, which is in which this autonomous system is embedded, right? Like even if you have industries, they're natural resources that you're consuming, then that breaks down. So can we still talk about general, like how useful then is this concept of general equilibrium? So now, if I understand the question correctly, which is how I understand it, I will now tell you my thoughts on this. There's actually two things. One of them is, yeah, this framework. It gives you these topological bounds, or I mean, it gives you bounds using topological methods on what is the maximum that you can do, right? And how to do it. So it tells you how you should be running your industry and how you should be pricing your goods for the maximum thing. But of course you can choose to uh, not do things that way. And the one thing that we were, and that's why actually Eric pointed me to this, is what we were thinking about is, can we have some kind of negative pricing of goods be a part of an optimal solution, in the sense that if you're making waste, you have to pay for the waste, right? So it's better than somehow carbon taxation, but because you're not just putting like brackets, you're actually saying if you're making 2 tons of carbon dioxide, and you're paying worth 2 tons of carbon dioxide, and so on and so forth. And so it would be nice to extend von Neumann's work for this setup, where now you have some sort of negative pricing, or where waste can be taken into account in a much better way. And I don't think the way he has it, at least with negative prices, you cannot just extend it, but with more thinking that could be done potentially. Secondly, the another thing with growing systems is that eventually there's what is it called, scale, efficiency of scale, or something like things scale, and then people come up with better ways of doing something once you've scaled something to a certain point, right? So typically how this shows up in an economy is that you might be growing exponentially, but then someone will come up with a new innovation to do something, and then that spurts off a new industry, and things are happening in a different way now. So another thing that you can do with von Neumann's framework is that his result is really true only for irreducible economies, in the sense that you cannot have a subset which can run by itself. If you can have a subset which runs by itself, then you don't have this uniqueness of the growth factor and so on anymore. But I suspect what's happening is that when you have this sort of nesting, where let's say you have some industry to do something, but then another industry comes about to that can speed up certain parts of the first industry. You have this sort of trophic layering, right? Or in industries, and then for Neumann's results, they don't hold true as they are, because they only really hold true for irreducible systems. But it can give you insight on how the whole network, the whole this sort of nested trophic layers of economy, of the economy, can be made optimal. And maybe this links to evolution in the sense that, once we, I mean, this math is still, it's not new, of course, but it has been overlooked a lot by the economics community for reasons I can say more if anyone's interested, what I think. But once we develop this math further, then I think we should be able to say something about trophic levels, and about optimality in trophic levels. And I think then we can link stuff to evolution, to
Mm.
like actually, and try to see if that matches things that we see in nature and so on. But I really think it's this sort of, this multi-level thing that comes about, that one. And number two, that we forget the embedding. We were forgetting the embedding. But once you put both of these things back in, and then try to do the math, then I think we get something that's more realistic and closer to something that's giving us insight about evolution.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, very, very, yeah, super interesting. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about why all of this was this math has been overlooked in economy, but in economics. But I did want to move to the
Mm.
Slido. So somebody's asking if you've heard of Chemical Organization by Francis Heiligen, and I think it's Heiligen.
Or Heiligen or something.
Heiligen.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. I
Heiligen.
I, I do.
Oh yeah, yeah. So they define things like self-maintaining in organizations. I guess.
Yeah,
How do you think this is
yeah,
related?
yeah. So I remember during my PhD there was a time when I was like absolutely fascinated with Francis Heiligen's work, and I remember. So okay, this is completely unrelated, but he also has, I think this was his PhD or some thesis, where he has this, where he rederives special relativity in a very particular way, which I just loved. But whatever. So back to how I think his stuff is related to this. There is the, so he thinks a lot about control systems, which is not something that we have here at all. And in the sense that, for him, at least this was my impression back then. I need to, reread and look at this again. But a big part of his thinking about autopoiesis and self-maintaining systems, because I think he's a cybernetician by like training, and that's what he kind of did. So he was really interested in control systems, and now what I have here, in the sense that we just have this sort of topological, notion of autocatalysis. It doesn't really get you much to the dynamics. Like, it doesn't really tell you whether or not a system can grow. Like, it just says, it there is a potential, but like with real dynamics, can it grow, can it not grow? Those are different things. However, I do think we can now start taking this, and we can look at it from a control theoretic point of view. And that is some things that people have already done, but without knowing, without, there are people who are working on like controlling chemical reaction networks without knowing about autocatalysis. But indeed, I think when you can, like, merging those two things will really get us something closer to what Francis Heiligen means when he talks about, yeah, the things that he talks about, because it's really one level of sophistication higher than what I've presented here. But I think, yeah, it's a very nice, like, it's certainly related. Like, I mean, if he were to listen to this, he would be happy, but he would not be satisfied. Yeah, so that's
High standards, right?
yeah. Well, he's a really deep thinker. I mean, he has a website I highly recommend checking out if you have time.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, nice. I'll have to take a look. Sounds
yeah.
really cool.
It's like,
Oh yeah.
hmm.
But I guess like maybe in a similar vein, because Martin, when he was asking about if autonomy means that you don't need any inputs, he says that he was referring to chemical organization theory by Peter Dietrich.
Yeah.
So I guess, like, can you comment on that?
No, I don't know.
Oh, no.
This. Yeah. I
Gotcha.
don't know Peter Dietrich's work.
Gotcha. So would love.
But
to...
autonomy in what? But I guess I did clarify that, right? Okay.
I think so. Yeah. But going back to why all of this has been overlooked by economists, could you? I guess, like, could you share what?
Yeah. So in economics, you'll find these matrices called M matrices, which come up a lot. And so there's von Neumann, and then there's Leontief. Leontief's doing his work, and the model that they make of an economy is a much simplified version, where they say that each industry produces only one good, and it consumes different goods. So in some sense, that's like a special case of this, because we're now saying an industry can make multiple goods and consume multiple goods. So that's how this M matrices naturally come up. If you restrict that to the fact that industries can only make one thing, and when you do that, you realize that, like, it's indeed pretty, like, simplistic, right? Because if you have a petroleum industry, like, there are all of these byproducts that it's also making, and you can't just look at one and price things according to that one, because you really need to take into account everything that is making in order to make it, to give it, like, optimal pricing. But then you're really in this hypergraph world, and things are much more complicated, which I don't think they did. And then the people who are after Leontief, they really, they didn't read this, because he gave a formula and then they use that formula to do everything. And we can derive that framework within this framework, and it's somehow much more richer, as you would expect from anything from von Neumann, right? But so that's sort of the split. I have not seen as much work on von Neumann's and, like, tons and tons of work on Leontief's, but that's a very special case. And and I think, maybe people are going a certain way, but really you can't expect anyone to read anything these days. So yeah, it's what it is.
LLMs read things these days, and then they tell us about it. But yeah, very, very insightful. Just anybody have any questions or comments here in the room?
Yeah.
Let me pass the microphone to you two.
So you gave an example of the biotic and non-biotic reaction networks. And at least in this example, you found that the hallmark of the biotic one was that the strongest autocatalytic network was not a minimal one.
Yeah.
And you're interested in the generality of that.
Yeah.
So if you could just comment a little bit about how you would go about finding that. And I'm particularly interested in the transition, if that is a general distinction. In the transition, would that be guarded by some sort of energy barrier type thing, like any sort of barrier, or would it automatically induce selection to create eventually biotic networks?
Yeah, so I can tell you about, well, to answer your first question first, how would we go about actually investigating this? One is, there are ways to we can make artificial chemistries, we can make rule-generated chemistries. So like the Formose network that I showed you, the idea is that you specify the mechanisms, like for aldol addition or whatever, and then that generates the chemistry. So we can look at rule-generated chemistry, which is generated by mechanisms, and see how common it is to have autocatalytic networks in there. And then we can also look at the tons and tons of databases of metabolic networks. So we could look at that, and then we could see whether or not this thing is generic. So I think that would just be like an empirical thing to do. We could empirically just test that, or like take KEGG database, or like take databases from biotic world, and just do that. But then for your second question, it's like in the sense of evolution, how would we do this? Or so let me first tell you something that has been done. So this work by Sanjay Jain and Sandeep Krishna from like 2000, which is something about I don't know, emergence of AutoCAD. I don't know. It's a well like cited paper, so you will find it. But sort of the basic idea, the construction in that paper was, well, they weren't looking at this kind of autocatalysis. They were looking at a very, simple, in that Stuart Kaufman type RAF type of autocatalysis, where one where now you have multiple things, multiple species, and these species are catalyzing the formation of each other. Okay, so for example, you have A and B and C, and B somehow catalyzes the formation of A, and A catalyzes the formation of C. So this is the simplistic, or the pre-CRN version of autocatalysis was this. So for these networks, they did this numerical experiment which corresponds to the following physical scenario. So imagine that you're on you're there's a pool right next to like some river bed or sea bed or something, and every now and then water will come and it'll take away some species and it'll populate new species. Okay, so now you make a random network based off how these species are interacting with each other. So you say these are the species, and this one is catalyzing these ones, this one is catalyzing these ones. Maybe with some probability you can just draw, right, that how each species is catalyzing other species with some probability. And every now and then what you will do is you will let the system evolve to equilibrium, and then you will take the species with the lowest concentration. Okay, you'll take it out of the system and populate it with a new species which is randomly now connected to everything else. And what they found just by doing this enough times is you will start forming autocatalytic networks. The reason being, if you're a part of an autocatalytic network, then your concentration is high, right? So the chances of you being selected to be eliminated gets low. And once you start having an autocatalytic network, it feeds into other, and then now if there are other species that are either branches of it or related to it, then they also benefit from this, right? Because their concentration is high, and the one with the lower concentration is now removed, and so on and so forth. So this is an example of like just a stochastic network kind of model, where now through this algorithm you see that eventually what they found is that somehow the whole thing forms, or because it was like a finite size system, the whole thing is autocatalytic. Either it is the core, or it is connected to the core by some branch, and that's sort of the thing that will sort of generically happen in these systems. So of course, I mean, we would need to find versions of that to make an evolutionary system here, but that is an example of what has been done before. So I wouldn't know exactly how to, like, what kind of network algorithm will give us this thing that we're now if we can make some sort of random network algorithm that shows that indeed you have some sort of proliferation of more and more autocatalytic motifs, and how they can come together to become stronger. I don't know how to do it, but it would probably be somewhere along this line, is what I would guess.
Amazing. Any follow-up? Later? Okay, perfect. Amazing.
Over lunch.
Yes, it's lunchtime. So thank you so much. This was amazing. I'm really excited to talk more about this over lunch, perhaps over some sushi. So just before we go, so there's a question in the Slido, and I also am curious about this. So the general frameworks is hypergraphs, right? Right. So which paper or papers do you recommend that we read more in detail about? So yes, can we put them up on the slides again?
Yeah, not this one. Should I pull out the? Oh yeah. Well, this one, the 2024 paper by me. Yeah. Oh, but I don't have the title. Should I give that? I guess I can put it on the chat right later on.
Oh yeah.
But
yeah,
I can certainly share. So this, yeah. I mean, because there are like many sort of technical papers by people who do graph theory stuff, but I think my paper is more accessible because I was also learning this stuff. So I wrote it like someone who's learning this stuff rather than someone who knows this stuff. So yeah. So but this mapping between between chemical reaction networks and hypergraphs and and representing them as a pair of matrices, which is from where we get all the linear algebraic simplifications. That's in this paper, probably titled like Polyhedral Geometry of Autocatalytic Ecosystems, in the Journal of Mathematical Chemistry, where I'm the first author. So I will put it in the chat.
Perfect.
And then you can look at references in there. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much again.
Very shameless. But okay.
No, it's great. It's great. Yeah, I want to learn more. Okay, so that wraps up today. Thank you all so much for joining us. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you'll be the first to know about our next great event, including, of course, Crossroads. All right, until next time. Bye.